The grand ballroom of the Riverside Community Center had never looked so fancy. Golden lights hung from the ceiling like tiny stars, and white tablecloths covered round tables that usually hosted bingo nights and senior citizen meetings. Tonight was different. Tonight was the annual charity fundraiser. Everyone who was anyone in town had bought a ticket. Richard Sterling adjusted his black bow tie for the third time as he stood backstage. At 28, he was exactly where he wanted to be in life. His expensive Italian suit fit perfectly. His hair was styled just right. His brand new BMW was parked right outside in the VIP section. As the featured performer for tonight's event, Richard felt like the king of the world. He had every reason to feel confident. After all, he had graduated from the most prestigious music conservatory in the country. His apartment was filled with awards and certificates. He taught piano at the Elite Harmony Academy, where parents paid thousands of dollars just to get their children on the waiting list. His students regularly won competitions, and his performances always received standing ovations. 5 minutes, Mr. Sterling called the event coordinator, a nervous woman in a sparkly dress, who had been running around all evening making sure everything was perfect. Richard nodded and walked to the edge of the curtain to peek at the audience. The ballroom was packed with the town's wealthy elite. He recognized several familiar faces: the mayor, the bank president, successful business owners, and their perfectly dressed wives. These people appreciated real talent when they heard it. They understood the difference between serious, classical music and the simple tunes that regular people hummed along to on the radio. In the back of the room, almost hidden in the shadows, sat a woman who clearly didn't belong with this crowd. She looked to be in her mid-30s, wearing a simple navy blue dress that had probably come from a discount store. Her dark hair was pulled back in a basic ponytail, and she kept checking an old watch on her wrist like she had somewhere else. To be next to her sat a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with the same dark hair as the woman. The little girl was trying hard to sit still, but Richard could see she was getting restless. She kept swinging her legs and looking around the fancy room with wide eyes, full of wonder. The woman noticed her daughter's fidgeting and leaned down to whisper something in her ear. The little girl nodded and settled down a bit, but Richard could tell she was still excited to be in such a grand place. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice of the evening's host over the microphone, "please welcome our featured performer, the incredibly talented Richard Sterling." The curtains opened, and Richard walked confidently onto the stage. The applause was exactly what he expected, loud and appreciative. He bowed gracefully and took his seat at the beautiful grand piano that dominated the center of the stage. "Good evening," Richard said into the small microphone attached to the piano. His voice was smooth and cultured, the kind of voice that came from years of proper education and speaking to important people.
Ow.
"Tonight, I'll be performing Chopin's Ballade, No. 1 in G minor. This piece requires tremendous technical skill and deep understanding of classical music structure." He didn't really need to explain this to the audience, but Richard enjoyed reminding people how difficult his music was. It made his performance seem even more impressive when they understood what they were witnessing. Richard placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. Every note was perfect. His technique was flawless. Years of practice and natural talent came together in a performance that was technically brilliant. His fingers moved across the keys with incredible speed and precision, never missing a single note. The music filled the ballroom, complex and demanding. Richard played with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how good he was. He had performed this piece hundreds of times, and tonight was no different. Each measure was calculated, each dynamic change precisely controlled. When he finished, the audience erupted in polite but enthusiastic applause. Richard stood and bowed deeply, soaking in the appreciation. Several people called out bravo, and he could see heads nodding in approval throughout the room. "Thank you," Richard said into the microphone. "There will be a brief intermission before the second half of tonight's program." As the audience began to mingle and move toward the refreshment tables, Richard stepped down from the stage. Immediately, he was surrounded by admirers wanting to shake his hand and compliment his performance. "Absolutely magnificent," said Mrs. Patterson, the wife of the town's most successful real estate developer. Such technical precision. You can tell the difference between real classical training and amateur playing. Richard smiled and accepted the compliments graciously, but part of him was already thinking ahead to the second half of his performance. He planned to play something even more challenging, really show these people what serious music sounded like, as he made his way through the crowd. Accepting praise and making small talk with the wealthy patrons, Richard's attention was caught by a soft sound coming from the back of the room. Someone was humming. He turned to look and saw the woman in the simple blue dress, the one who had seemed so out of place earlier. She was still sitting in her chair, gently rocking her young daughter, who had apparently gotten tired during the formal performance. The melody she was humming was beautiful, not classical, but something warm and comforting that seemed to wrap around the little girl like a blanket. Richard found himself walking closer, curious about the tune. It wasn't anything he recognized from his classical training, but there was something about it that caught his attention. The melody was simple, yet it had a depth to it that was surprisingly moving. The woman noticed him approaching and immediately stopped humming, looking embarrassed to have been caught making noise during the intermission. "I'm sorry," she said, quietly, her voice carrying a slight accent that Richard couldn't quite place. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone. My daughter was getting a little restless." "Oh, you weren't disturbing anyone," Richard said, though his tone carried just a hint of condescension. "That was actually a rather lovely little tune you were humming. Very ... folksy." The woman, who had introduced herself to the person taking tickets as Carmen Rodriguez, looked down at her hands. "It's just something my grandmother used to sing to me when I was little." "How charming," Richard said, and he meant it to sound polite. But there was something in his voice that suggested he found it quaint rather than impressive. "Do you play piano at all?" Carmen shook her head quickly. "Oh no, not really. I know a few simple songs, but nothing like what you just played. That was incredible. So complicated and beautiful." Richard felt a familiar warmth of pride at the compliment, but he also felt something else, a kind of superiority over this. A simple woman who clearly didn't understand the difference between real music and the basic melodies she hummed to her child. "Well," Richard said, his voice taking on what he thought was a friendly tone, "knowing a few simple songs is a start, I suppose. Music education is so important, don't you think? Though of course there's quite a difference between playing around with basic tunes and understanding the true complexity of classical composition." Carmen nodded politely, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Her daughter had perked up and was looking at Richard with curious eyes. "Are you the piano man?" the little girl asked with the innocent directness that only children possess. "I am indeed," Richard said, bending down slightly to address her. "Did you enjoy my performance?" "It was very fancy," the girl said honestly, "but I liked the song my mama was singing better. It made me feel happy and sleepy at the same time." Richard chuckled, the kind of laugh adults make when children say something they find amusing but naive. "Well, that's very sweet. But you know, there's a big difference between lullabies and real concert music. What I played tonight takes years and years of serious study to master." He straightened up and looked back at Carmen. "Though I'm sure your little songs have their place, of course. Different music for different purposes, as they say." The conversation was interrupted by the event coordinator calling for everyone to return to their seats for the second half of the evening's program. Richard excused himself and headed back toward the stage, already thinking about his next piece and how impressed the audience would be with an even more challenging selection. But as he walked away, he couldn't quite shake the memory of that simple melody Carmen had been humming. Despite himself, he found it playing in his head, its warmth a strange contrast to the complex but cold precision of the classical pieces he had spent his life mastering. He pushed the thought away. After all, he was Richard Sterling, graduate of the finest conservatory, teacher at the most exclusive academy in town. He had real talent, real training, real success. What could a woman humming folk songs possibly teach him about music? The second half of the evening was about to begin, and Richard was ready to remind everyone in that ballroom exactly what real musical mastery looked like. The second half of Richard's performance had gone exactly as planned. He had chosen an even more challenging piece this time, a complex composition that required lightning-fast fingerwork and perfect timing. The audience had been suitably impressed, giving him another round of enthusiastic applause as people began to stand and stretch during the final intermission. Richard felt that familiar rush of satisfaction. He had proven once again why he was considered one of the finest pianists in the region. The wealthy patrons were already approaching him with compliments and business cards, eager to book him for their private parties and corporate events. But something was bothering him. He accepted congratulations and shook hands with the evening's sponsors. His eyes kept drifting back to the corner where Carmen sat with her daughter. The woman was quietly gathering her purse and the little girl's jacket, clearly preparing to leave early. This annoyed Richard more than it should have. Here he was giving a world-class performance, and this woman seemed completely uninterested. She hadn't even been paying attention during his second piece. Instead, she had been gently stroking her daughter's hair as the girl dozed against her shoulder. Leaving so soon? Richard found himself walking over to their table, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. Carmen looked up, startled. "Oh yes. It's getting late for Sophia, and I have to work early tomorrow morning." "Sophia," Richard repeated, looking down at the sleepy child. "That's a pretty name. Spanish, isn't it?" "Yes," Carmen said simply, not offering any more information. "Couldn't help but notice you seemed a bit distracted during my performance," Richard continued, his tone still polite but with an edge to it. "Classical music can be challenging for some people to appreciate. It requires a certain level of musical education to fully understand." Carmen's cheeks flushed slightly. "I'm sorry if I seem disrespectful. Your playing was beautiful. It's just that Sophia gets tired easily, and I didn't want her to disturb other people if she got restless." Of course, Richard said, but his voice suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her explanation. "Though I have to say, that little melody you were humming earlier has been stuck in my head all evening. It's quite catchy in a simple sort of way." He paused, looking around the room at the well-dressed crowd that was still mingling and chatting about his performance. Several people were watching their conversation with curious expressions. "You know," Richard said, his voice getting a bit louder, "I was thinking about what you said earlier, about knowing a few simple songs. I'd be curious to hear what you consider music." Carmen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I really don't think that's necessary. We should be getting home." But Sophia had perked up at the mention of her mother's music. "Mama, tell him about the song you made up for me," the little girl said with innocent enthusiasm. "The one about the butterfly and the flower." "Hush, Mia," Carmen said gently, but Richard had caught the exchange. "You write your own songs?" he asked, his eyebrows raised in what looked like amusement. "How? ... Creative." By now, several people nearby had stopped their own conversations to listen. Mrs. Patterson, the real estate developer's wife, had moved closer with obvious interest. A few other wealthy patrons were also paying attention, sensing some kind of entertainment developing. "It's nothing really," Carmen said, her voice getting quieter as she realized people were listening. "Just silly little songs I make up for Sophia when she can't sleep." "Oh, come now," Richard said, his voice taking on a tone that sounded friendly but felt anything but. "I'm sure they're not silly at all. In fact, I'd love to hear one. We have this beautiful piano just sitting here after all." He gestured toward the grand piano on the stage, its polished surface reflecting the golden lights of the ballroom. Carmen shook her head quickly. "Oh no, I couldn't. I haven't played piano in years. I'd probably embarrass myself in front of all these people." "Nonsense," Richard said, and now his voice was definitely carrying to the other guests. "Music is music, right? If you can hum a tune, surely you can play it on piano. Unless..." He paused dramatically. "Unless you don't actually know how to play." The implication hung in the air like a challenge. Carmen's face flushed deeper, and she looked down at her hands. "I do know how to play," she said quietly. "I used to play when I was younger, but that was a long time ago." "Well then, there's no problem," Richard announced, his voice now loud enough that most of the people in the nearby area could hear him clearly. "Why don't you show us one of your original compositions?" Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together. "Oh, how delightful. A little musical variety show. "Oh, I think that's a wonderful idea, Mr. Sterling." Da-da-da-da-da-da. Other people began to murmur agreement, and Carmen realized that what had started as a simple conversation was turning into a very public situation. Her heart began to race as she looked around at all the expectant faces. "Please, I really don't think this is a good idea," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but Sophia, who didn't understand the tension in the air, was bouncing with excitement. "Mama, you should play. Remember how you used to play for Abuela? Before she went to heaven, you always made her cry happy tears." The mention of her grandmother hit Carmen like a punch to the chest. She remembered those evenings so clearly, sitting at her grandmother's old upright piano in the tiny apartment, playing the melodies that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. Her grandmother would sit in her favorite chair, tears streaming down her weathered face. As Carmen played the songs that connected them to their heritage and their history, that piano had been sold years ago, along with most of her grandmother's belongings, when Carmen needed money for her mother's medical bills. She hadn't touched piano keys since then, too afraid of the memories it would bring back, too afraid of how much she had lost. "Your grandmother?" Richard asked, his voice taking on a false note of sympathy. "How touching. I'm sure she would have loved to see you play in such a grand setting." Carmen looked up at him, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach twist. He wasn't asking her to play out of genuine interest or kindness. He was setting her up, expecting her to fail, wanting to prove some point about the difference between real musicians and people like her. "I don't think I remember the songs well enough," Carmen said, making one last attempt to escape the situation. "Surely you remember something," Richard pressed. "After all, you were humming so confidently earlier. And your daughter seems to think you're quite the musician." He turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers. "Folks, this is actually a perfect example of what I was talking about in my masterclass last week. The difference between formal musical training and, well, folk music traditions. Both have their place, of course, but it's interesting to see them side by side." The condescension in his voice was becoming more obvious, and Carmen felt a familiar anger beginning to build in her chest. She had dealt with people like Richard before, people who assumed that because she cleaned offices and served coffee, she couldn't possibly understand anything sophisticated or meaningful. "Mama," Sophia whispered, tugging on her mother's dress, "are you going to play the song about the mountains? The one that sounds like wind?" Carmen looked down at her daughter's hopeful face, and back up at Richard's expectant expression and the crowd of wealthy strangers waiting to be entertained by her expected failure. Something inside her shifted, a spark of the pride and strength that had carried her through years of struggle and loss. "You know what?" Carmen said, her voice still quiet, but now carrying a note of determination. "Maybe I will play something." Richard's smile widened, and he gestured grandly toward the stage. "Wonderful. This should be educational for everyone." Carmen stood up slowly, her legs feeling shaky, but her resolve growing stronger with each step. As she walked toward the piano, she could hear whispers from the crowd behind her. Some sounded curious, others amused, and a few, she hoped, sounded encouraging. Sophia clapped her hands together and bounced in her chair. "Yay, Mama. Play the pretty song." Carmen climbed the steps to the stage, her simple blue dress looking even more out of place under the bright stage lights. The grand piano loomed before her, its keys gleaming like white teeth in an enormous smile. She sat down on the bench and placed her hands on the keys, feeling their familiar weight and texture. It had been so long since she had touched a piano, but somehow her fingers remembered where they belonged, in the audience. Richard crossed his arms and settled back to watch what he was sure would be an amusing display of amateur playing. Had set this up perfectly, the contrast between his sophisticated, classical performance and whatever simple tune this cleaning woman was about to stumble through would only make his own talent shine brighter. He had no idea that he was about to learn the most important lesson of his musical career. Carmen sat at the piano bench, her hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the keys. The stage lights felt warm on her face, but she could feel the cool stares of the audience behind her. She took a deep breath and tried to remember the last time she had played piano in front of people. It had been 15 years ago at her college recital. She had been so nervous that day too, but for different reasons. Back then, She was nervous about playing perfectly, about impressing her professors and earning her music scholarship. Tonight, she was nervous about not embarrassing herself in front of people who already thought she didn't belong here. Richard stood at the side of the stage, his arms crossed and a slight smirk on his face. He was clearly enjoying this moment, probably already imagining how he would graciously compliment her brave attempt. After she finished stumbling through whatever simple song she was about to play, "Take your time," Richard called out, his voice carrying across the quiet ballroom. No pressure at all, but there was pressure. Carmen could feel it from every person in that room. Some were genuinely curious. Others were clearly waiting to be entertained by what they expected to be an amateur performance. A few people had even taken out their phones, probably hoping to capture something amusing to share with their friends later. Carmen closed her eyes for a moment, tried to block out everything except the feeling of the piano keys under her fingertips. These keys felt different from her grandmother's old piano, smoother, more responsive, clearly expensive. But a piano was a piano, and music was music. She thought about Sophia, sitting in the audience with her bright eyes full of trust and excitement. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that music wasn't about showing off or proving anything to anyone. Music was about sharing something beautiful with the world, about connecting with people in a way that words couldn't. Carmen opened her eyes and began to play. The first notes were soft and gentle, like a whisper in the dark. She had chosen to play a melody that came from deep in her heart, a song she had created years ago when Sophia was just a baby. During those long nights when her daughter couldn't sleep and nothing else would calm her down, at first, the tune was simple, just a basic melody that seemed almost too quiet for the grand ballroom. Some people in the audience shifted in their seats, probably wondering if this was really all she could do. Richard's smirk grew wider as he heard the elementary beginning, but then something began to change. As Carmen's fingers found their rhythm, the music started to grow. What had begun as a simple lullaby began to transform into something more complex, more layered. Her left hand found a gentle bass line that provided a foundation, while her right hand began to weave in harmonies that hadn't been there moments before. The melody was still the same one she had hummed to Sophia countless times. But now it was expanding, becoming richer and more sophisticated. It was as if Carmen was taking this simple song and showing everyone in the room all the love, all the hope, all the dreams that had been woven into it over the years. In the audience, Sophia's eyes grew wide with wonder. She had heard her mother hum this song hundreds of times, but she had never heard it played like this. It was like watching a butterfly emerge from its cocoon, the same beautiful creature but transformed into something even more magnificent. Carmen's fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence. The muscle memory was coming back now, all those years of training and practice that had never really left her. But more than that, all the life experience she had gained since leaving music school was flowing through her playing. The melody began to tell a story. It spoke of a young woman who had once dreamed of concert halls and recording contracts. It spoke of difficult choices made out of love, of dreams set aside to care for family. It spoke of long days working multiple jobs, of worrying about bills and wondering if there would be enough money for groceries. But it also spoke of joy, the pure, overwhelming joy of holding your child for the first time, the quiet satisfaction of making someone else's day a little brighter with a kind word or a helping hand, the deep love that exists between mothers and daughters, between grandmothers and granddaughters, stretching back through generations as the music continued to build. Carmen began to incorporate elements from her grandmother's old songs, traditional melodies that had been passed down through her family for generations. She wove them seamlessly into her own composition, creating something that was both deeply personal and universally relatable. The audience was beginning to change too. The whispers and shifting had stopped completely. People were leaning forward in their seats, caught up in the music despite themselves. Even those who had taken out their phones were lowering them, too absorbed in the performance to remember they had been planning to record it. Mrs. Patterson, who had been expecting to hear some quaint folk tune, found herself wiping away tears. The music was touching something deep inside her, reminding her of her own grandmother, her own lost dreams, her own moments of quiet joy and profound love. Richard's smirk had completely disappeared. He stood frozen at the side of the stage, his mouth slightly open, as he realized that what he was hearing was not the amateur performance he had expected. This was real music, played by someone who understood what music was supposed to do. Carmen's playing continued to evolve, becoming more adventurous and expressive. She began to improvise, letting the music take her wherever it wanted to go. Her fingers danced across the keys with a fluidity that came not from years of rigid classical training, but from a deep understanding of melody and rhythm that seemed to flow from her very soul. The song began to build toward a crescendo, and Carmen let all of her emotions pour through her fingertips. All the frustration of being looked down upon, all the pride in her daughter's accomplishments, all the love for her family, both living and dead, all the hope for a better future, it all became part of the music. The melody soared, filling every corner of the grand ballroom with sound that was both powerful and delicate, complex and simple, sophisticated and accessible all at the same time. This wasn't just technical skill. This was artistry in its purest form. As Carmen played, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like herself again, like the person she had been before life had forced her to make difficult choices. She felt connected to her grandmother, to her daughter, to every person in that room who had ever loved someone, ever lost someone, ever hoped for something better. The music began to wind down, returning to the gentle lullaby that had started it all. But now that simple melody carried with it all the weight and beauty of everything that had come before. Carmen played the final notes with the same tenderness she had used to sing her daughter to sleep countless times. But now everyone in the room could feel that tenderness too. When the last note faded away, there was complete silence. Carmen sat at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys, hardly believing what had just happened. She had intended to play a simple song and get off the stage as quickly as possible. Instead, she had shared something deeply personal with a room full of strangers. And somehow, miraculously, they had understood. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Carmen began to worry that she had done something wrong, that maybe her playing hadn't been as good as she thought it was. She started to turn around to look at the audience, ready to apologize and hurry back to her seat. But then someone began to clap. It was slow at first, just one person, then another. But within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted in applause, unlike anything Carmen had ever heard. People weren't just clapping politely. They were standing. They were cheering. They were wiping away tears as they applauded. Carmen turned around on the piano bench, her own eyes filling with tears as she saw the reaction of the crowd. These people who had seemed so distant and intimidating just minutes ago were now looking at her with genuine admiration and respect. In the front row, Sophia was clapping her hands together with pure joy, her face beaming with pride for her mother. Several people in the audience were openly crying, moved by the beauty and emotion of what they had just experienced, and at the side of the stage, Richard Sterling stood in complete shock, finally understanding that he had just witnessed something extraordinary. The applause continued for what felt like forever. Carmen sat at the piano, overwhelmed by the response, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She had never experienced anything like this, even during her college performances. When she had played technically perfect pieces, the applause had never felt this genuine, this emotional. She stood up slowly from the piano bench, her legs still shaky from the intensity of what had just happened, as she turned to face the audience. Fully, the applause grew even louder. People were still standing, still clapping, and many were still wiping tears from their eyes. Sophia was jumping up and down in her seat, clapping her hands together with pure joy. "That's my mama," she called out proudly, her young voice cutting through the applause. "That's my mama who played the beautiful song." Carmen felt her own tears starting to fall as she looked at her daughter's beaming face. This little girl had never seen her mother receive recognition for anything other than working hard and taking care of their family. To see Sophia so proud and excited made Carmen's heart feel like it might burst. She began to walk down the steps. From the stage, ready to return to her seat, and hopefully escape all this attention. But as she reached the floor of the ballroom, people began approaching her from all directions. "That was absolutely incredible," said a woman with silver hair and an expensive pearl necklace. "I haven't been moved by music like that in years. Where did you study? Who was your teacher?" Carmen didn't know how to answer. She looked around nervously as more people gathered around her, all asking questions and offering compliments. "I used to play when I was younger," Carmen said quietly, still not quite believing this was really happening. "But that was a long time ago." "Well, you certainly haven't lost your touch," said an elderly man in a perfectly tailored suit. "I'm Dr. Harrison, and I run the music program at the community college. Have you ever thought about teaching? We're always looking for instructors who can connect with students on that level." Teaching? Carmen hadn't thought about anything like that in years. She had been so focused on just getting by, on making sure Sophia had everything she needed, that she had never considered that her musical abilities might be worth something to other people. Before she could answer, Dr. Harrison, another person, stepped forward. It was a younger woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "I'm Jennifer Walsh," the woman said, extending her hand. "I coordinate the music therapy program at Children's Hospital. What you just played, the way you connected emotion with music, that's exactly what we try to teach our therapists. Would you be interested in talking about possibly working with us?" Carmen shook Jennifer's hand, still feeling like she was in some kind of dream. Music therapy? Working at a hospital? These were opportunities she had never even imagined could exist for someone like her. "I don't have any formal training in therapy," Carmen said honestly. "That's okay," Jennifer replied. "What we can't teach is what you just showed us, the ability to touch people's hearts through music. That's a gift." As more people continued to approach Carmen with business cards, offers, and compliments, she noticed that Richard was standing off to the side, watching everything unfold. His expression was complicated, part amazement, part confusion, and if Carmen wasn't mistaken, part shame. Eventually, the crowd around Carmen began to thin out as people returned to their conversations, and the evening began to wind down. Carmen collected the business cards that people had pressed into her hands. Still hardly believing that any of this was real, she was helping Sophia put on her jacket when Richard finally approached them. He walked slowly, like someone who wasn't quite sure what he was going to say. "Carmen," he said, his voice much quieter than it had been earlier in the evening, I owe you an apology." Carmen looked up at him, surprised by the change in his tone. Gone was the condescending confidence he had displayed before. Now, he just looked like a young man who had learned something difficult about himself. "Made a terrible mistake tonight," Richard continued, his words coming out slowly, as if he was choosing each one carefully, I assumed. I thought I was completely wrong about you." Carmen didn't say anything right away. She could see that. This was hard for him, and part of her felt sorry for him. But another part of her was still hurt by the way he had treated her, the way he had tried to embarrass her in front of all these people. "Your music was... Richard struggled to find the right words. "It was everything that mine wasn't. I played perfectly tonight. Every note was exactly right. Every timing was precise. But your music had something that mine completely lacked." "What's that?" Carmen asked quietly. "Soul," Richard said simply. "Heart. Real feeling. When you played, you weren't trying to show off how skilled you were. You were sharing something beautiful with all of us. You were giving us a gift." Sophia, who had been listening to this conversation with the serious attention that children sometimes give to adult discussions, tugged on Richard's jacket. "My mama is the best piano player in the whole world," she announced, with the absolute certainty that only an 8-year-old could possess. Richard smiled down at her, and this time his smile was genuine, not condescending. "You know what? I think you might be right about that." He looked back up at Carmen. "Where did you learn to play like that? That wasn't just natural talent. There was real training behind what you did up there." Carmen hesitated for a moment, then decided there was no point in hiding the truth anymore. "I had a full scholarship to study music at the university. I was supposed to graduate and maybe audition for orchestras or graduate programs." "What happened?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested he was afraid he might not like the answer. "My mother got sick during my second year," Carmen explained. "Cancer? I dropped out to take care of her. She lived for 3 more years, but by the time she passed away, I had Sophia, and well, life just took me in a different direction. Was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Here he had been, thinking he was so superior to this woman, when in reality she had sacrificed her own musical career to care for her family. She had given up everything he took for granted and had done it out of love. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly, "giving up music?" Carmen looked down at Sophia, who was now leaning against her mother's side, tired from the long evening. "I never gave up music," Carmen said. "I just found a different way to use it. Every lullaby I sang to Sophia, every song I hummed while working, that was all music too. Maybe not the kind that gets applause in fancy ballrooms, but it was just as real. But tonight," Richard said, "tonight you got to share your music with all of us." How did that feel? Carmen thought about the question seriously. "Scary," she said honestly. "But also ... wonderful. I had forgotten what it felt like to connect with people through music. I had forgotten that music could be about more than just making noise to pass the time." Richard nodded slowly. "I think I had forgotten that too. I've been so focused on being technically perfect, on impressing people with how difficult my pieces are, that I forgot why I started playing music in the first place." "Why did you start?" Carmen asked. "'Cause it made me feel something," Richard said, his voice almost a whisper. "Because when I was a kid and I heard someone play piano, it was like magic. It made me believe that beautiful things were possible in the world." "That feeling doesn't have to be gone," Carmen said gently. "Maybe you just need to remember that the goal isn't to impress people, it's to share something beautiful with them." Richard was quiet for a moment, thinking about her words. "Would you ... double quotes," he started, then stopped, looking uncertain. "Would I what?" Carmen prompted. "Would you maybe be willing to have coffee sometime? Not like tonight with me being arrogant and stupid, but just to talk about music. I think you could teach me things that I never learned in all my years of formal training." Carmen studied his face, looking for any sign of the condescending attitude he had shown earlier. But all she saw was genuine humility and a desire to learn. "I think I'd like that," she said finally. "But right now I need to get this little one home to bed." Richard nodded and stepped back to let them pass. As Carmen and Sophia headed toward the exit, several other people stopped them to say goodbye and to remind Carmen to call about the opportunities they had discussed. As they walked out into the cool night air, Sophia looked up at her mother with sleepy but happy eyes. "Mama," she said, "tonight was the best night ever." Carmen squeezed her daughter's hand as they walked toward their old car. "You know what, Mia? I think you might be right." Behind them, through the windows of the community center, they could see Richard still standing in the ballroom, staring at the piano and thinking about everything that had changed in the course of one evening. 3 months had passed since that unforgettable night at the charity fundraiser. Carmen's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The business cards that people had pressed into her hands that evening had turned into real opportunities. Real chances to build a new future for herself and Sophia. She was sitting in her small apartment on a Saturday morning, grading practice sheets from her new students. The coffee table was covered with colorful drawings and simple music exercises from children who were just beginning their musical journey. It still felt surreal that she was teaching piano. Again, after all these years, Dr. Harrison from the community college had been true to his word. He had offered Carmen a part-time position teaching beginning piano to adult students who had always dreamed of learning, but never had the chance. The pay wasn't huge, but it was enough that Carmen had been able to quit her evening cleaning job and spend more time with Sophia. Even better, Jennifer from the Children's Hospital had invited Carmen to join their music therapy program. 2 days a week, Carmen now worked with young patients, using music to help them cope with illness and recovery. It was the most rewarding work she had ever done, watching children's faces light up when they managed to play a simple melody or sing along to a familiar song. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID and smiled when she saw Richard's name. Over the past few months, their weekly coffee meetings had become something she genuinely looked forward to. "Hello, Richard," she answered. "Carmen? I hope I'm not interrupting your weekend." His voice came through the phone. much warmer and more humble than it had been that first night they met. Not at all. Just working on some lesson plans. What's up? I have something to ask you. And I hope you won't think I'm crazy, Richard said, and Carmen could hear the nervous excitement in his voice. Try me, Carmen laughed. You know how we've been talking about music being more than just technical skill? About connecting with people and sharing emotions through playing? Of course, Carmen said. She and Richard had spent many hours discussing this over coffee, and she had watched him slowly transform his own approach to music. Well, I've been invited to perform at the annual Spring Arts Festival next month. It's a big event, much bigger than the charity fundraiser. And I was wondering, Richard paused, taking a deep breath, would you consider performing with me? As a duet, Carmen nearly dropped the phone. You want me to perform with you at a real festival? More than want. I need you to, Richard said earnestly. I've been practicing the pieces I plan to play, and they sound technically perfect, but they're missing something. They're missing the heart that you bring to music. I think together we could create something really special. Carmen felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. Since that night at the fundraiser, she had played only for her students and the children at the hospital. The idea of performing in front of a large audience again was both thrilling and terrifying. I don't know, Richard. Festival audience is very different from a charity dinner. What if I mess up? What if I embarrass you? Carmen, Richard said firmly, after what happened 3 months ago, I think it's pretty clear that you could never embarrass me. If anything, I'm worried about embarrassing you. I'm still learning how to play with real feeling instead of just showing off. Carmen smiled at that. It was true. Richard had been working hard to change his approach to music. He had started teaching free lessons to underprivileged kids at the community center. And she had watched him discover the joy of sharing music rather than just demonstrating his superiority. What would we play? Carmen asked. That's the best part, Richard said, his excitement growing. I was thinking we could take your lullaby, the one you played that night, and I could write a complimentary piece that weaves together with it. Something that shows how different musical backgrounds can come together to create something beautiful. The idea gave Carmen goosebumps. Her simple lullaby, the one she had hummed to Sophia countless times, becoming part of a formal festival performance. It seemed impossible and wonderful at the same time. Can I think about it? Carmen asked. Of course. Take all the time you need, but Carmen, I really hope you'll say yes. I think we could show people something important about what music is supposed to be. After they hung up, Carmen sat staring at the phone for a long time. Sophia came running into the living room, fresh from playing outside with the neighbor kids, her cheeks pink from the cool air. Who is that, Mama? Sophia asked, plopping down next to her mother on the couch. That was Richard. You remember him from the fancy dinner, right? Sophia nodded enthusiastically. The piano man who said sorry to you. That's right, he wants me. To play piano with him at a big music festival? Sophia's eyes grew wide. Really? That's so cool. Are you going to do it? Carmen looked at her daughter's excited face. I'm not sure, Mia. It would be in front of a lot of people. What if I get scared and can't play well? Sophia thought about this seriously for a moment, then crawled onto her mother's lap and put her small hands on Carmen's cheeks. Mama, she said with the wisdom that children sometimes possess. When you played at the fancy dinner, you weren't playing for those people. You were playing for me and for Abuela in heaven and for all the love in your heart. If you play like that at the festival, it will be beautiful no matter what. Carmen felt tears prick her eyes as she hugged her daughter close. When did you get so smart? I learned it from you, Sophia said simply. That evening, Carmen called Richard back. I'll do it, she said as soon as he answered. Really? That's fantastic. Carmen, I promise we'll practice until you feel completely comfortable. We'll make this something special. And they did practice. Every week, they met at the community center after Carmen's teaching hours and worked on their duet. Richard had composed a beautiful piece that started with his classical training, but gradually incorporated the folk melodies and emotional openness that Carmen had taught him to value. Carmen's lullaby remained the heart of the piece, but Richard's composition surrounded it like a garden, providing structure and harmony while allowing the simple beauty of the original melody to shine through. As the weeks passed, something magical happened. Their music began to represent more than just two people playing together. It became a conversation between different worlds, the formal and the informal, the technically trained and the naturally gifted, the privileged and the struggling. But more than that, it became a story about respect, about learning from each other, about recognizing that everyone has something valuable to contribute. The night of the festival arrived, and Carmen stood backstage, wearing a simple but elegant dress that Jennifer from the hospital had helped her pick out. Her hands were shaking slightly, but it was more from excitement than fear. Richard appeared beside her, looking nervous himself. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," Carmen replied, and she meant it. They walked out onto the stage together, and Carmen was amazed by the size of the audience. Hundreds of people filled the outdoor amphitheater, families with children, elderly couples, teenagers, people from all walks of life, as they took their places at the two grand pianos that had been set up for their performance. Carmen looked out into the crowd and spotted Sophia in the front row, sitting with Dr. Harrison and Jennifer, who had become like extended family over the past months. Richard began the piece, his playing as technically perfect as always, but now infused with the warmth and humanity he had learned to embrace. When Carmen's lullaby joined in, weaving through his composition like a golden thread, the audience fell completely silent. For the next 10 minutes, Carmen and Richard told their story through music. They showed how different approaches to music could complement rather than compete with each other. They demonstrated that true artistry comes not from perfection, but from the willingness to share something real and meaningful with others. When they finished, the silence stretched for a moment before the audience erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. People were standing, cheering, some crying, all moved by what they had just experienced, as Carmen and Richard stood to bow. She looked out at the crowd and saw faces of all ages and backgrounds united in their appreciation for something beautiful. She saw families holding each other a little closer, young people inspired to pursue their own dreams, elderly folks remembering their own lost opportunities with hope instead of regret. But most importantly, she saw Sophia jumping up and down, in the front row, clapping her hands and beaming with pride. After the performance, as people crowded around them with congratulations and requests for future performances, Carmen and Richard stood together, both knowing that this was just the beginning. "Thank you," Richard said quietly, so only Carmen could hear. "For what?" she asked. "For teaching me what music is really supposed to do," he replied. "For showing me that the goal isn't to be better than other people. It's to make the world a little more beautiful." Carmen smiled and looked out at the crowd, at Sophia, running toward them with her arms outstretched, at all the new possibilities that seemed to be opening up every day. "You know what?" she said. "I think we both learned something important." And as Sophia launched herself into her mother's arms, Carmen realized that sometimes the best things